Introduction. So, welcome everyone to the Michener Art Museum virtual program. Tonight, we will go inside the creative process behind one of our most vibrant and family-friendly exhibitions. Tonight, we have Director of Exhibitions Joshua Lessard, who will share how he transformed an exhibition organized by the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art into an immersive, playful experience visitors see today. You'll learn about how the exhibition's layout, color palette, and interactive elements were developed, how original artwork and process materials were selected, and how the final design balances education, nostalgia, and fun. So before I turn over, if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A, and we will take some time following Joshua's presentation to answer them. So without further ado, here you go, Joshua. It's all yours.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Jen, and welcome everyone. I'm going to take a second to share my screen here. And I think we should be good to go. Well, great. So welcome to, as Jen mentioned, the behind the scenes, right? My goal tonight is to keep this a little bit informal, talk through a lot of the things that we kind of did, and just kind of have some general fun, right? This is the sausage is made story. This is how everything came together. And so I'm kind of inviting you to join me on this fun little journey. Now, where does an exhibition like this all begin? And my first note is that it starts with you, right? So, looking at the Michener Art Museum strategic plan, we have kind of looked at three major pillars. We have five pillars, three of which are focused on community, becoming a cultural hub and cultivating community partnerships, developing inclusive and varied exhibitions and programs, and defining and expanding our audiences with a particular focus on family and youth visitors. And so, an exhibition like this, when it comes together, is really starts with the idea of engaging audiences, engaging community, and engaging folks like yourselves. Now, again, it takes a village. So there are far too many people to thank from the Michener team as well. But a couple that I do want to call out just because they are incredible. You know, my partners in crime in the work and a lot of the stuff that I'll be showing tonight also has their hand in it. So obviously Laura Turner Igo, the Jerry and Marguerite Lenfest chief curator, Abby Lua, the assistant curator, Emma Falcon, our museum registrar, Vincent Hawley, the exhibition manager, and Casey Rayposh, the director of learning engagement, who all in many different capacities, and Jen as well, and all of the other learning and engagement team were incredible. And then I also want to just draw your list of the many, many, many contributors at the Michener team. Additionally, we did not create this project on our own. So in addition to the Michener, there were sort of three existing authorities that we had to work with. Every decision that was made related to the exhibition sort of had three sign-offs. Our primary contact through this was the museum. So B on this list, dead center, is the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art in Amherst, Massachusetts, who organized the show, was our primary collaborator. And I should note that this is the first exhibition, as I understand it, of Eric Carle's material on display domestically, outside of the Eric Carle Museum since his passing in 2021. So this has been a very interesting show to develop with them. This was one that we worked together on developing. So the Michener Art Museum had a lot of say in sort of the checklist, the balance, the way things were laying out. And we talked a lot about different curatorial directions with the team at the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art. There were sort of four other people there that I want to call out because, again, it does take a village. Rachel Eskridge, Jamie Pagana, Isabel Ruiz, and Rachel Haas are sort of our like major four. And so thank you to all of them for their contributions to the project. The Eric and Barbara Carle Foundation is also a major contributor to the project or collaborator in that they represent the legacy organization of Eric Carle and Barbara Carle as well. And then somewhat surprisingly, there's sort of the ghost in the room, or sort of the maybe the giant elephant in the room is, of course, Penguin Random House as the publisher, who is the copyright holder for all of Eric Carle's material. So every time that we had to make a decision related to the exhibition, it kind of had to touch all three of these groups in addition to the Michener team. And lastly, this is me. So if you want to know who I am, my background before I came to the Michener is that I am a licensed architect. I worked in private practice in the Philadelphia area. I joined the in-house team at the Penn Museum, and while I was there, I did a lot of exhibition work in a lot of different spaces. While I was an architect, I was doing museum design. So if you're familiar with um, the Franklin Institute's Your Brain exhibit and things like that. That's what I was working on, Smithsonian projects. We did a lot of work there as well. So this is a little bit of my sort of background in research and things that I've done. But now what I want to do is jump into these sort of untold stories, right? These behind the scenes pieces of the Eric Carle exhibition. Now, understanding the space that we are working in, so is an important piece of how we start all of our projects. So this is in our Patton Smith Della Penna Fernberger Gallery, which we colloquially call the Martin Gallery because of that little dog leg there. It happens to be called the Martin Wing. Um, and so in green, what you'll see is that it's a 4,100 square foot room that hosted, if you've been there, if you haven't been, if you're one of the people on the list who hasn't been yet, other exhibitions you might have seen in the space was our Siva at 40 exhibition, Never Broken, or the Keith Haring show. Those are the other things that have been in that space recently and also are a large scale to kind of give you a sense of what we're dealing with. So we knew this was going to be a bit of a marquee show for us. So we wanted a lot of effort. This is a multi-year engagement in terms of its development. And we're thinking about it as a feature element of the museum when it's open. Now, additionally, as I mentioned, we were in conversation with the Eric Carle Museum. And so one of the things that we really had to deal with was that we had four major themes that we wanted to talk about in the exhibition itself. There was an intro area, there is the small bugs, big feelings. There is friends who fly, slither, clomp, and crawl. And then there is, of course, the very friends beyond the book. So those are our four sort of major themes. And what we're looking at in them is trying to figure out how they lay out onto a space that is 4,100 square feet, right? So that's one of the biggest challenges that I have going into all these projects is the hierarchy of information, the hierarchy of flow inside of a museum exhibition. And one of the things that you'll also know about the Martin Gallery, if you've been, is that we have two entrances or exits. So one of the challenges that we have is people can enter from either direction. And so force flow or what are called linear flow exhibitions are somewhat of a challenge in the space because the other door on one side, the Beans Gallery door, is sometimes closed because that's also a rotating gallery. So we tend to do our exhibitions in a not what's called a non-deterministic flow, um, in that there's no set entrance or exit, and you can kind of ping pong around the exhibition and still get the majority of the content in a digestible manner. It's going to make sense no matter which way you're moving. Uh, Now, the other thing is, as I mentioned, that like my background is such that like I was thinking of this in this grand experiential way. Like this is my default of trying to solve the challenge of four major themes in one large room is to go big. um, to do these immersive spaces, to do these sort of big showy things, these anchors. In exhibition design, we often call them attract features or attract modes. It's that thing that anchors a room, but it's also something that you might see at a great vista. And you say, what is that thing? I want to know. It's super cool. So my first set of pass of going at this was, again, I mentioned the Your Brain exhibit. And so the two sort of catty corner images here are benchmark images from that, where I was kind of referencing past experiences designing for youth and family audiences and thinking about showy experiences, thinking about a multi-layered exhibition, thinking about spectacle, right? Is that if you think about the Eric Carle books, they are immersive, right? The whole page is covered in collage. And so that was my first pass. And if you look at the very first concept, and spoiler alert, this is not what we did, and I learned very quickly later on why it wouldn't work, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. My first idea was to create basically rooms in a room. And if you look at the floor plan, what you'll see, and I'm just going to point to the corner here, it's kind of hard to see, like Very Hungry Caterpillar, for example, kind of anchors one corner of the space and kind of has a little house onto itself. And then, of course, the area in the middle that might have had the Book of Growth, which was one of the books I think we actually wound up cutting from the exhibition, would also kind of have its own house, and then the sort of area on the upper left portion would have again another little house, and then there's kind of these outdoor areas. So it was sort of like the farm and barnyard or forest and nighttime themes. And so the books from those categories would end up in those sort of spaces. Now, uh, what does that look like? This was my first design rendering that, of course, almost comedically is something that we wound up presenting to the board. And I think we had some expectations around it, which, for better or for worse, we've delivered, I think, on the idea of spectacle without necessarily needing to create tiny houses in the room. Um, but I will say that after doing this exercise, when we started getting into the actual content, when we started getting to actually look at and understand and know the objects in the Eric Carle story, this very quickly felt to me like the wrong solution. And I want to talk a little bit about that as well. So, a little bit of the background here is that if you look at benchmarking of other institutions who are also doing Eric Carle shows, and this particular example I'm showing is Cooking with Eric Carle from the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art in Amherst. They're doing something much simpler. And so I had a lot of questions about why, and we talked a lot about it with that team and kind of understanding that one of the things that both the foundation and the museum are trying to do now is to present Eric Carle's material as fine art, right? For people to understand that this is a skill and a profession and a craft that is cultivated over a lifetime, and really becomes an expertise the way you would see a master painter or a master carver, a master sculptor. This is someone who is exceptional at collage and at creating storybook art. And so one of those things that they have done is also pulled back on those immersive environments so as not to trivialize the experience of seeing picture book art. And that was something I began to really kind of understand and to take to heart. We knew that as they were going to be loaning us the objects, that they would be coming in these frames. So we also had a material condition that we were going to have to react to. But we also had to acknowledge that there's a desire to present this material in a stricter or, I guess, more minimalist manner. Now, additionally, and I saw this as a challenge, right? I was like, oh my God, everything I've done is wrong. It's terrible. I need to start from scratch, and all of that. And one of the things is that I wrote here, Help Arrives, a voice from the past. As I kind of got to know the biography of Eric Carle and got to also read a lot of his writing around his experiences of visiting museums or looking at things in the world. And you'll see on the title wall text, we talk about that. And in the intro to that very first section, which is the background context, sort of the historic work of Eric Carle, we talk about two of those stories, one of which was looking at small things with his father, and the other was sort of a treatise, a little essay that Eric Carle wrote about how to look at things in museums. And those were two sort of new guiding lights for me, was how do we create an experience where you can appreciate and immerse yourself in the environment of small living things, while also appreciating to look at objects and art in a slow manner, a deliberate, intentional, and slow manner. Um, and so when we get into that, we also started to look at the process, right? We wanted to tell Eric Carle's story in the exhibition as well. And so my job as the exhibition designer was sort of like looking at these objects, looking at the things that we in the curatorial team were kind of collaborating on together. And for example, in that very first section, you have a sketch of a stag beetle. And then in that section, we also have a collage that Eric had done of a stag beetle. And so what you're able to see with these two things side by side is you can treat them almost as comparenda the way you would in a formal encyclopedic exhibition, to say like this was the study and this was the final work. And that is something that we do not often with children's book illustration, right? If you think about collage work, you often don't see process in this way. And that was really exciting, right? This was sort of a moment when we got to say like, oh, now we can do something more. We can get at the story behind the work. We can start to present this in a way that invites people into the world of making picture book art, but also invites them into sort of getting to know the characters, right? To get to know that there's a deliberate study of these small living things that Eric is performing before making those books and kind of getting to know those characters as well, building out those characters. So at that point, once we've kind of had this revelation of how we're going to do things, the palette that I'm working with and my sort of approach changes, maybe not from something as so intensely immersive, but a little bit more austere, a little bit more restrained, and a much more deliberate palette. So one thing that I thought hard for, and if Jamie Pagana is on the call, she can attest to this, is these collages, right? So this is these sort of large scale environmental collage papers are actual high resolution scans of collage papers that Eric made. And so what I wanted to do was to make sure that when we do have large scale environmental graphics, that they're actually in Eric's hand. He's producing the work that we see on the wall, and we're able to present that throughout the exhibition to add the color, to use color to kind of help you also understand the different sections that you're in. So there is sort of as you move from one section to another, the color um, of the environmental graphic changes, and they also kind of speak to each other a little bit. So, for example, that first section that you see there, and these are renderings, not photos, but the first section that you see about early works is the green collage paper that picks up on the green in the Very Hungry Caterpillar on the title wall. If you're familiar with the second section, which is Small Bugs, Big Feelings, you'll also know there's a giant sun, which you will see in a moment. But the collage paper that we have there is the bright orange. And so we have this idea of like the brightness, the warmth of the sun and the collage paper coming together. The lower right here is our sort of nighttime animals. This is where you have the firefly and our cricket story coming together. And of course, those collages are dark blue to sort of evoke nighttime. And then our far corner, we have the very friends beyond the book. And that's kind of this red, vibrant, textured paper that invites you to kind of probe things a little further. So as I mentioned, like one of the things that was really exciting was being able to dive deeper into those stories to showcase those stories. And so what you can see here on the left and the right is that we have our stag beetle composition, but then you can also see how it laid out in the final gallery. So this is now we've moved from renderings to the photos. This is the final arrangement where you do have the sketches in the case there, which was an important piece too. The sketches were together and the collages were together because of how the curatorial direction was kind of telling things, but having them immediately proximate to each other also helps you do that deeper dive of relating one object to the other. And then this is something that we also took as a motif sort of throughout the exhibition as well. So when you get into that second section of Small Bugs, Big Feelings, you will find the Grouchy Ladybug as a story. And what you'll see here is two of the book maquettes that are shown that are called book dummies, but they're sort of sketch creations of the final product. And one of the things that's really delightful is that you can see that Eric was experimenting or playing with this idea of that page sequence growing in size. So it starts with that tiny little the fly, and then it kind of moves up to the larger animals, and so it's kind of replicated in the final book. So you can really draw those comparisons and studies over time. Now, the other part of this is we recognize that the visitor and thinking about our audiences is that story making is only one theme. So the Eric Carle theme of making stories is one piece of this equation, but there is an inevitable reality that the visitor is going to come in having also read these books before coming in. I think most visitors will probably come in having read the books. And so there's a huge part of this exhibition, which is story sharing. And there's kind of a reality of nostalgia. I know that and I have all of different versions of the books here. They're kind of around, but I think the key is that we knew that story sharing would be something that people were going to want to think about, and it's also some of the most iconic stories of our childhoods. These are our to borrow an Inside Out reference, it's like these are core memories. These are things that we anchor to childhood and we associate with childhood. So when we want to share these things with the children in our lives as adults, we want to be able to facilitate those conversations. And so you'll see like the spread here is sort of some of the most iconic stories, right? Where we have the very quiet cricket. We have the lower left the cricket as well. And then we also have our very Gretchen Ladybug, or our Gretchen Ladybug. She's not a very uh, so ultimately what that comes down to was thinking about the gallery in this yin yang context of creating large seating areas, kind of using scale of the space that we had. We have 4,100 square feet. How do we use scale to our benefit? Where before I kept trying to make things smaller, right? I kept trying to create little houses or little rooms or a tiny, a recreated garden that could have a book associated with it. So I was trying to reduce the scale. Now what I was trying to do was to open things up, trying to create as much floor plate as possible in very deliberate areas to invite people to sit and dwell and to share. So we were creating um, almost like mini libraries inside of our gallery space. And so you'll see here on the left and the right these sort of like large seating areas, lots of little dots because those are benches and things and um, what we were thinking about. And that was really what the ultimate resolution came to be, was that we were going to invite people to sit and think and share and explore together those particular stories. And so the Small Bugs Big Feelings section has its own sort of mini theme in design terms. I was trying to think about what the aesthetics of that section was going to be, and this is a design rendering that was like halfway through the process, thinking about it, where we were thinking about memories and making new ones. So this being probably the first space that you encounter because of how the museum circulation works is people arrive most often to the Martin Gallery through our Commonwealth Gallery. So we knew kind of where they were going to land as a primary pathway, and they tend to turn left when they come in. So we knew that this was going to be the first seating area that they encounter, and it's probably going to be the one where they're going to want to do the first round of memories and memory sharing and making new memories with their families. And that's also because we had the anchor of the Very Hungry Caterpillar in this section, which of course is one of the most iconic of Eric Carle's pieces. And so we knew that this was going to be a space where that trigger, that memory trigger, that the affect of a visitor um, is going to be one of sentimentality, remembrance, those kinds of things. Uh, Now, as you move to the other, if we go to that yin yang comparison, if we move to the other side, the sort of mini design motif there is exploring stories together. This section is called Friends Who Fly, Slither, Clomp, and Crawl. These are not necessarily insects, these are not small bugs, big feelings. These are all of the other animals in Eric Carle's repertoire, or many of the other animals, not all of the other animals. And one of the things that we knew would happen here is that youth audiences, family audiences are going to probably want to explore these ideas, the animals themselves, the sort of feelings that they're being evoked in the different books, but also a little bit more playful, right? This is when you have family and youth audiences, some of what they're going to want to do is going to be to probe and explore and kind of sit and dwell with ideas for a bit. And there's a little bit of play that's going to have to happen in the gallery space. And so we wanted to create a space to accommodate that. And that's why the logs kind of appear, right? We go from one side, which we have very soft, durable beanbag chairs, and the other side where we're kind of exploring this indoor-outdoor motif a little bit further with sort of a carpets or rugs that evoke grass and the grass motif around the perimeter as well. So if I go back to the rendering here, you'll see that this section is inviting you to feel like a small bug. So the perimeter here is dirt that you can see, which is taken from the Very Hungry Caterpillar book series. There's the sun in the background, and then the carpet, the rugs that are on the floor are meant to evoke the soil and the dirt as well. The bean bags are rocks and pebbles. And then, of course, you have the leaves overhead. As you move to this section, this is where maybe you're growing to be at a slightly different scale, right? Where we're talking about other types of animals. So you're no longer a caterpillar, you might be a mouse or a snake. And so the scale shift is a little bit subtle, but it is one where now you're at the size where you can have logs and grass and things like that as well. Originally, we had talked about maybe making the bees on the ceiling because one of the books here had a collection of bees in it. We ultimately settled on using the leaves in both sections just out of ease of section and representing the animals at different scales was kind of an issue. So we wanted to remove all of the animals from the actual environmental graphics. And so everything in the space is just context building. And what you'll also note is that each of these sections has itself a little library that contains all of the books from that section. And that was kind of an important piece for us. It did require us going and hunting down, other versions of books that are currently out of print. Actually, this one will be coming up in June. The very clumsy Click Beetle board book will be was currently out of print, but is coming back online very shortly. So if you're looking for that one, it can be found. But each of these sections has the books to be read as well. And I think what I kind of wanted to show with the photos of the install is the success behind that idea, right? That these are spaces that are used by family and youth audiences to share those stories, right? This is something where uh, kids are exploring on their own. They are having these sort of like fun play moments what I absolutely love and adore is walking in there and hearing like the roar of a lion or the sound of a snake or something, knowing that people are using the space um, to evoke those animals and those feelings as well is wonderful. And likewise, then the other part is the sharing between generations. So this is the other thing we're trying to evoke or create a space for, is this adult sharing with child and that sort of learning or sharing moment, that sort of coming together moment. And that doesn't have to be around the book. That's the other thing that I really enjoy about the way that this is kind of resolved is, and you can see this in the lower center image, is there's a lot of people just kind of dwelling in the gallery and taking it all in. Kind of enjoying, walking around and pointing at the imagery and the collages. There are like, superlative facts around the artworks that we chose, where I think it's like 98% of the work in the show is all original Eric Carle work. So it's, done and performed by his hand. There are two pieces in the show that were not, one of which is the award of the Very Hungry Captivates, the bronze cast. Eric Carle did not cast bronze, so we know that there's a different artist who produced that piece. And there's a facsimile of one of his early posters. Because it's a poster, it was a run of the posters in a later date. But everything else in the show was created by Eric, and that was really important. And the other thing is that over 50% of the pieces are in the books themselves. So that's kind of really super cool. We really enjoy that fact as well. And then something that is good with that is that, again, people are able to kind of sit and dwell and take things in um, at a slightly different pace as well. Okay, and then so that's like the major behind the scenes of like the run through the curatorial direction, and I would love to get questions on it. But the other thing is here's some other cool stuff from behind the scenes that didn't fit into this very beautiful narrative that I think is just really fun and that I wanted to share anyway. So one thing that I love to share is a little bit about how the design of spaces works, how we use, I think a lot of people, or having spoken with artists, think that the exhibition design process is maybe where their anticipation of it is where it was 50 years ago, that I'm using a lot of hand techniques, that we're laying stuff out, that we're doing a lot of maquette work. And the reality on the ground is that things have gotten very technical. So I'm using a program called ArchiCAD, which is a building information modeling program. And we can get very specific about light controls, understanding how the space is going to behave, mapping things out at scale well in advance. And that gives us and our install team the ability to install under very tight timelines. So it's kind of nice to have these sort of long-term, long lead planning things that we do. And this is just kind of just an insight into what that is and what that might look like. Likewise, the way that we communicate internally, I think there's very few opportunities for people to see how do museum staff communicate to each other across the install timeline. So I included this sort of set of elevations to kind of show you like when we're installing, what am I communicating to the install team and how are they getting those notes? And one of those things that I thought was really fun was sort of this like broader gesture of like, watch that the clip line doesn't get too close. Or, we have these sort of like sketch lines, dash lines of where the crops are going to be around certain objects. So it's just kind of like how we produce these elevations in order to communicate the installation, but likewise, we're also testing them at scale to make sure that everything is going to fit well in advance of the actual installation itself. So basically, we install the show twice, once before digitally and then once in real life. This is a little bit about what the install process looks like. So we have on the left here, what you'll see is that this is the space when we start doing some of the furniture lay-in. FF and E kind of things. And that is, you can see the rugs and the carpets and stuff back there. We're also, this is before lighting. So what you're looking at is the Anila Aga lighting track arrangement superimposed with the Eric Carle layout. So you can see that there's some hot spots and things that would have to get changed later. On the upper left, or sorry, upper right, we have the image of the title wall before it was installed. So this was the print. It's a vinyl overlam. And what happens is that it comes in a giant roll and you have to let it sit on the floor for a while for it to get flat, just like every other kind of large rolled thing. And that's kind of just interesting to see in process. It comes as these giant sheets, the way you might install a wallpaper. And I think that for people, when they do get that kind of behind the scenes look, it's kind of interesting to see that like we are doing basically a full architectural switch out of a room. So if you think about like how intensive it can be to wallpaper a room and how you're like, oh, thank God, having just done a renovation of my own house, like I'm like, we wallpapered our back staircase and I was like, oh, thank God I don't have to think about that for 30 more years. And the joke is on me because every day in our exhibition world, we are changing our exhibition graphics, which are wallpapers in their own right. And then the bottom right image here shows, because I get this question a lot and often, what does packing look like? And so this is, the blue horse from Brown Bear, Brown Bear. And this is what a crate will look like. So you have the object in its frame. We don't, if possible, when things transit, we leave them in their frames when they are safe to do so. They get packed and wrapped. That whole assembly is then packed out in a tray of ethafoam, and that is put inside of a wooden crate, which has more padding inside of it, and is then the rigid barrier and the weather barrier to the exterior of the object. One of the other cool things that we did with this show, and I am a huge graphics nerd, so I'm sorry if this is maybe not your thing, but we actually created a custom typeface for this show that was derived from Eric Carle's books type. Um, so one of the things here is that the Eric Carle Museum, when they do certain things, don't necessarily use this type kit in this way. They might use individual letters for certain things. So they provided us with the letter set, a vectorized version of the letter set, but each individual letter there um, was kind of its own thing. You couldn't like type with it. And so one of the things that we did internally was isolate each of the letter forms, bring it into Illustrator. I used Font Maker, which is just a plugin basically, or an add-on that you can get into Illustrator. And then you assign the glyph value. And so we were actually able to create a fully functioning font kit typeface out of that, which is called Carle VHC font. So if you're wondering, both Brad in marketing and I have used that pretty extensively, I think, for this show, which has been pretty exciting to have created that. Again, I'm also a big graphics nerd, and one of the questions that I get asked a lot is like, well, how do you produce those large graphics? I think one thing I've earned a bit of a reputation for at the Michener is having done large scale wallpapers for things. And one of the things that I have not successfully explained to those people, because they asked me multiple times, and if you are one of the docents who has asked me that question before, this is the slide for you. These are the printers that produce those graphics. So they are 10-foot wide, large scale printers. This is inside of the shop at Street Media. And what they do is they produce those wallpapers as if you are printing a normal document, just at giant scales. And those get cut down and then mounted to the gallery walls. So this is what that process looks like. It is what we often say is design made possible by machines. I could will this into existence only because there are giant printers that allow me to do so. Another thing that we talk about a lot in exhibitions that doesn't necessarily come to the fore a lot and often, or people don't think about because it does come with ease, is our sort of statutory compliance around accessibility. So one thing we do think these are several of the design standards that are considered with almost everything that we do in the public realm or the public facing realm of our work at the museum. You may have noticed on the floor plan that I have the 5-foot turn radius shown at every single intersection, juncture, corner, or doorway for that reason. But I'm going to talk about why this is also super important here is that cases for this particular exhibition were important because the objects needed to be safe. These are some of collage is some of the most sensitive material that you can put on display because the pigments themselves are fugitive. They're very light sensitive. The adhesives that were used are also very problematic. Rubber cement is not a long, stable, or archival safe material. So it oftentimes has to be conserved with other materials or preserved, like basically disassembled and reassembled using safer materials. And so one of the things that we had to do in this exhibition was that we had to think about case buffering. So we used a desiccant, which in our case is silica gel that's conditioned to a 50% RH, relative humidity, and that is inside of the cases. So if you're wondering why on, for example, the Cricut and the um, Firefly book covers, cases that there's a very funky sort of buildup underneath those objects. It is because that is the housing where we have two trays of 1 pound each of silica gel buffered at 50% RH. And that's sort of keeping the volume of that case, the air inside of that case, at a safe relative humidity for those objects. And the other thing that we did with the cases and why the ADA piece here is important is because we lowered the datum of everything in this exhibition because we were thinking about youth and family audiences. We knew that our target audience for this show is going to be a little smaller than it tends to be for our other exhibitions. And so while other gallery datums might be at 60 inches or 58 inches, this show is down around 54, and that's to create eye level of the hanging of the artwork for our youth audiences, and also all of our cases are brought down to lower levels. And so, while they might typically be 36 and 42, to get artwork up to that ADA height of uh, a seated adult in a wheelchair, it's accepted that the eye level is usually 48 inches. So you try to bring art up to that level. In this particular exhibition, what we're doing is we're actually dropping that datum down to 30 inches or 2 feet, so that our youth audiences can also see the material. And lastly, I just wanted to note is that we also have these sort of breakout spaces as well. On the left side here, you can see that where we had the activity guide, and this is something I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about as well. We knew from the run of previous exhibitions that families really appreciated having a family guide, and so we were able to provide space for people to do that. It's available when you walk into the gallery right on the right side for you, but also there's some watercolor pencils and things that you can use to fill in some of those sections and a table, as well as the Meet the Very Hungry Caterpillar um, playground element that you can find in that space as well. And thank you very much. That is my full presentation run, but I do think that maybe there will be questions. I fully assume that there will be questions related to this.
There are actually, they were popping up during your presentation. Thank you, Joshua. That's so
And
interesting.
logistically, Jen, do you want me to close this
Um,
and answer
yeah,
questions?
probably. Yeah,
Probably. Okay, we can do that.
thank
Uh,
you.
yeah, no problem.
Okay, so the first one is from Alice. She wants to know how the books featured were selected, and then how were the specific illustrations from those books selected?
Great question. So, a lot of that came down to a conversation or multiple conversations between Rachel Haas, Isabel Ruiz, and then myself and other representatives from the Michener. We were talking about what objects were available. So that was one thing. A challenge that we had was that the first international exhibition also being planned is also running right now, or is which is the 50th anniversary of the Very Hungry Caterpillar being translated into Japanese. So a lot of the Very Hungry Caterpillar material was otherwise eaten up by this other show. And so there was a lot of negotiating around that particular story. And the others were which objects are available. I mentioned one of the things that I was really kind of thinking about was what are the superlative stories, making sure that material had never been seen before or had not been on view. And so those were the things that we kind of thought about when it came to that. And then inversely. So I think we actually started with the individual objects to some extent, was what objects are safe to display, safe to travel, and will fit in our space, and also has a large volume together. So what was interesting was things like the very clumsy click beetle, for example, had a very large body available for travel that had already been framed. And what was exciting about that was that we knew we were able to pick the book because we could show the most material from that book. So I think it was more that the groupings of objects that were available kind of informed which books we chose to show. Um, and then we kind of divvied them out into their appropriate sections because we kind of had those themes in mind before we had the individual checklist. We had kind of a draft checklist where we knew these were things were kind of available. We kind of created the themes and then through an iterative process revised that checklist to kind of make the most sense of those themes as well. Did that
Okay.
answer?
I think you
That sounds
did.
good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was fascinating. There are a couple comments and questions about the graphics. One, Kristen said, "We love the giant sun. Thanks for explaining the large color prints. I wondered about their significance."
Mm.
Carolina asked, "When did you realize to add the brown ground lower wall banner to help engage the children to their height and have them use the seating area to their scale?"
Pretty early on. I think when we had decided um, that we wanted those areas, I think once the idea of the reading areas kind of landed, we knew that we wanted it to feel more immersive. And so benchmarking against other institutions. So the Frist had done a similar installation where they had included other ground banners, which included a version of the soil, a version of the grass. They also had the poppies from Will You Be My Friend, and a couple of the other sort of like low banners. And we knew that we really liked that. That I thought that was a very successful thing at other venues. And so when we talked about that with Jamie from the Eric Carle Museum as their graphics lead, what I was sort of asking for was sort of like, hey, can you give me collateral or print objects that will help us meet this requirement of having a low datum, of creating immersive environments? And, we had sort of suggested the dirt and the grass, and Jamie agreed that those would be great. So she was able to produce or help us find high resolution versions of them, scans from the books. Uh, and then that again informed, kind of that iterative design process. As we said, like, okay, well, we want this section to be immersive. We think it should be very Hungry Caterpillar themed. It'll have leaves, it'll have rocks, it'll have soil. And so naturally, the rug, the rug wanted to be the dirt, the seating wanted to be a pebble. And so when you try to think about what seating, it's not a bench that's going to be a pebble shape. It's going to be something like a beanbag chair. Um, Kind of, so that kind of rolled in its own very natural way. It was sort of selecting those things based on the environmental aesthetic as well.
Okay, here's another question about the graphics. Will any of the large graphics, like the giant sun or the giant caterpillar, get repurposed afterwards?
I would love that. Unfortunately, it will not be able to be repurposed as a graphic, is what I'll say. The process of taking it off the wall, because in a lot of other ways, vinyls are very peelable. So, like, most other institutions, not museums, use vinyl graphics because they are repositionable. In the museum world, we use what I mentioned was a vinyl with an overlam, like a matte overlam, but the adhesive that you use on the back of that is very intensive, and that's because it has to survive children doing all of the things. Um, and so the process of taking that off the wall tends to both damage the graphic and that it kind of deforms stretches or does all sorts of other crazy things. But it also tends to damage the wall. So we have to repaint, paint and spackle the room every single time that we do that because it takes chunks of wall with it. That said, one of the things that we've been doing at the Michener that is very interesting recently is turning former exhibition graphics into things like tote bags and wallets and stuff. So there's sort of a mercantile second life to them, which I've been very much enjoying seeing these things kind of go out in the world. The banners that we've produced have become something that you can also now have. And I think that that's a really great way. It takes virgin material out of the sort of commercial stream, and sort of we get to reuse it in a different way. So it's a reduce, reuse, recycle. Not necessarily that we're going to use them as exhibition graphics, but you can go and buy it as a tote bag in the near future, hopefully.
And the questions keep coming. Linda wanted to know, did you have to do any conservation work on site for the collages? Were there any issues that resulted from transit of the objects that required repair?
No, um, not that required repair. We definitely had all of the usual suspects kind of things where one of the objects had slipped in the mat, so that did require a repositioning. But the collage itself, the Carle Museum is very, very adept at handling Eric Carle's collages. I think that they've built a real wonderful expertise around it. And so we did have to conserve objects before transit. So several of the objects underwent conservation work at the Eric Carle Museum, or that they facilitated conservation work of them happening, so that they would be more stable for loan. But after transit and arriving at the Michener, there was nothing that required conservation, with the exception of the slit in the frame.
Excellent. One last question we have. You mentioned this was the first or one of the first Eric Carle shows on tour since his passing in 2021. Did he previously take an active role in collaborating with museums showing his art on tour? Any good stories about Eric you got from his museum?
Um, so I think the answer is yes. Obviously, at least um, his health did decline later on, but since the founding of the institution, I think that he was definitely involved. And Rachel Haas, who was the primary curator on the museum, the Eric Carle Museum side, uh, did have, had worked with Eric for many, many years. She was someone who I think began in his office as a letter opener, if I'm getting that correct, sort of responding to children's mail. And she had kind of cultivated or developed a very strong relationship with Eric over the years. And so getting to know him, and Barbara, I should also know, is Barbara and Barbara as well. So she had some really wonderful stories. Do they have to, many of them don't necessarily deal with museum practice per se. I know that he um, felt very strongly about engagement, thinking about this material as for youth audiences in the way that the books themselves were for youth audiences. And so that we don't lose sight of that combined vision, that we're not going to like try to make this a MoMA show um, of the work. He kept also referring to his work over his life as being informed by his early poster work. When he was an art director, a lot of the work that he was doing and a lot of the work that he did in art school in Germany was posters, making posters. And that's where he really also enjoyed using collage the most. So he thought a lot about page spreads and book covers through that lens, that each one of these things kind of is a story unto itself and presents all of the information you need on a single page. They just happen to be a really great leaflet together. So I think that we thought about that in the presentation of the exhibition, knowing that that was something that Eric used in his own life to develop his storybooks. So when you see the display of the material together, they're almost presented as if they were posters. They each one, though it stands in composition with the others, is kind of a standalone object, and that we wanted to make sure that people could appreciate that at scale. It's one of my favorite things about the show as well, and I think it's one of Eric's favorite things about his own work, um, is the tininess of things, that you can really get in there. And, my favorite object in the entire show is it's a one-page spread where it's just the cricket. And it looks, you look at it and from a distance, it almost looks like there's a cricket sitting on a frame, right? Like, it's so highly detailed. And then when you think about the fact that that is just paper collage and two tiny pencil strokes for the antenna, um, it's wild. Like, so I think that like that is something we also kind of brought to it, was that treating each of these almost as if they were poster spreads. You could think about them as individual art objects, was a major factor.
Amazing. Well, it is a beautiful exhibit, Joshua.
It was
Um,
very fun too. I want to note that. Like, I talk about serious stuff, but it was a really fun time. And I want everyone to have fun in it, but also like selfishly, this was a good one to work on. So
oh,
it was great.
for sure, for sure. It was, I know I have seen many, all ages, literally all ages, and I have seen adults sitting in those beanbag chairs together reading books.
Oh
So
yeah.
it literally is everyone. So I think you definitely nailed it with hopefully people can appreciate that this is real art. I know this is always the question
Right.
or a discussion, fine art versus craft versus we did have a question in our book club the other day, and I don't know if you
Yeah.
can answer it. If he ever felt, obviously you don't know him or get in his head, but if anyone said anything about, was he dissatisfied with just doing children's books? And I hate to phrase it like that because that kind of gets into the fine art versus craft, but um,
It's an interesting question. I think that there is definitely there's a lot of layers to that, right? And so we're walking purely in the world of conjecture at this point. So I want to qualify it that way. This is my hot take. Um, Things that I've read that Eric kind of wrote or thought about a lot. And in talking with the museum as well, some of the things that they've mentioned is Eric was always content with children's book and storybooks as a medium, right? That the idea of that was a very important thing for him and one that he chose to reiterate over and over and over again. That said, one of the things that he does also take on later in the later years is the sort of abstract expressionist approach to collage, that the collages that he's sort of producing have not necessarily meaning per se, but are representative of attitudes and gestures and emotions. He's aware that the choices he's making are informed by a mood or a state of being. And so, you kind of can't divorce that. And I think he even talks about that with Mr. Rogers in this sort of the little short that they have on that show, where he talks about making collage. And so I think that that's something that's present. What was also interesting is that late in the latest years of his life, he kind of lost the ability to speak or to form full cogent sentences, words, things like that. And I don't know exactly what that timeline looked like, but as it was told or recounted to me, is that he was drawing and making art up until the very last moment, even though he couldn't communicate what it was about. Like he was using that platform to communicate emotion and intent. And so I think like to your question about like, but that's not a child's book, right? That's not a picture book for youth audiences. That is art that he's making as expression. Um, and so, I don't think he would say that he was discontent with picture books. But I think that there is definitely other explorations that he's doing as well.
and I love that. That's I think sometimes, I mean, artists have to make a living. So
Yeah.
the fact that he could do that and share his talent with so many people and reach so many people is huge. Um, are there any other questions from the audience? I don't see any other. I had one last question. Do they have any of his painted tissue paper at the museum? Do you
I'm sure
know?
they do. Yeah, the scans that we have are some of them. So, um, yes, they definitely have them. Are they
Fabulous.
on display? I don't think so. So that's, I think, maybe
Probably
the
not.
challenge of like, can you go and see just the tissue papers? I'm not sure. Um, but maybe if I find out, I will have you follow up. I'll let you know.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Joshua, that you've done a great job, and
Yeah.
it's really interesting to get these behind the scenes. So thank you everyone for attending. Don't forget to see the exhibit. It is on display until May 24th, which is really, unfortunately, just around the corner. So thank you everyone, and good night.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.